Tom, did you want to comment on the new name for the GPI?
You know, briefly only. Again, with all due respect to my transnational security colleagues, I think security is a loaded word, and peace is already a complicated notion enough here. I'll trust that Zoe and Steve and everyone who's worked on Global Peace Index from the beginning considered this question quite carefully. And so I would not burden it with sort of asking this question. This is something that I often ask students. I don't actually allow students to use the word security in my class. This is true.
It's banned, is it?
That's from your childhood.
No, because I think people use the word security without, you need to define it more carefully. What kind of security are you talking about? State security? Are you talking about human security? Are you talking about economic security or social security? So unless you're going to define that also, I don't think
it just becomes the S word. Yes.
Yeah.
Strategic.
Very good. Please.
A theme that came up a number of times, you were challenged on it, is the internal versus external conflict thing, why they're weighted differently, are they the same things? And then someone just said, boy, North Korea and Colombia are right next to each other. Aren't they really different? Well, let me suggest that the utility of this might be in decomposing some of these things. And you already published the internal score and the external score. They're right there. And if you had the lists separate, you would find countries that I call generalizers. Those that is, they're low on both, or they're high on both, or in the middle in both. But if you subtract one from the other, you get a very small number. But then you're going to get some that are what I would call differentiators, where they're very high on one and low on the other. And depending on which one is first, you get a negative number or a positive number. Those might tell you about really different patterns of peace, or if you like going the other way, very different patterns of conflict and violence. And that might help analysis rather than say, well, these countries have the same score, they must have a similar root of conflict, which I think naive users will be prone to do. So I would advise encouraging more of that in the analysis as a way of emphasizing some of the value of what's here.
Yeah, so I think even though Tom just shut down the transnational security idea on security, I think it was also your idea to exactly decompose and disaggregate the index. Now, we only do have 10 minutes left, and I've been focused on the panel up here because the discussion was so good, but please, questions from the floor.
Mr. Dysart, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about all of the different reports that Freedom House has in terms of the history and development, because Freedom in the World is the one that I would equate with the GPI. And so as the Nations in Transit and Crossroads and all these different reports came out, why did that happen? What went into it? Because perhaps GPI only being 4 years old will eventually be able to have all of these different subsets, like an international law report specific to gender, things like that. It could serve as a model.
Sure. Answer now? Or
Yeah,
well,
maybe just repeat. I'll repeat the question for the microphone. And so really, Jake, if you could speak about the different reports coming out of the Freedom House.
Sure. Yeah, I wouldn't actually necessarily correlate anyone specifically to the GPI. I mean, freedom in the world and freedom of the press are both global and measure every country, or purport to. So in that sense, yes. Countries at the Crossroads has more indicators and a finer grain, which is somewhat more like GPI, especially if you take the 23 and the 33 indicators that go into it. As far as, if you're going to have narratives that are not bullet points, that actually have any narrative flow at all, it's really, there's not a lot of point to it if you're not going to bring in basic context. And for a lot of countries, that is history, that is who your neighbors are, that is who what happened after decolonization, potentially, whether you went on a democratic path or you had a strong man take over right away. So, basically the goal of the narratives for each report is to explain the scores. And, there are a few other indexes that do the same thing or a similar thing. The Bertelsmann Transformation Index has narratives that accompany it, and some others pick specific themes when each report is released. I'm not saying that every report has to be just like Freedom House's by any stretch, but it is helpful in terms of differentiating in the way that Mark was just talking about why countries that appear similar at first glance in terms of their scores, what are the factors that go in there. The only other thing I wanted to add briefly was about the regional organizations, because it hasn't been addressed quite yet.
Please.
Regional organizations are interesting because it really depends on what you're looking at. As far as taking the GPI and talking to regional organizations about it, things like trade integration, economic issues, military spending, they'll be very receptive because for one thing, they'll be happy to talk about how their neighbors are all spending too much on weapons and how we need to end the arms race in region X. They tend to be much less receptive when you get into political considerations because, for all the criticism the UN takes as being dominated by the permanent members of the Security Council and the large states as a whole, regional organizations can be much worse in that sense. I mean, they're basically, incumbent regimes are looking to protect themselves on political questions first and foremost. So, for instance, when Freedom House has tried to engage with regional organizations, we've had very limited success. With ASEAN, there's been very little success in terms of pushing political type things, democracy, human rights type issues. The OAS has had more success. OAS should be easy. They're almost all democracies in Latin America. And yet you tend to get a lot of pushback when you suggest greater monitoring of those sorts of issues. So it is important. It's hopefully will become more important, but it's very difficult on certain questions currently.
Thank you.
You didn't answer my question. When Freedom House started with one report and slowly built more reports, I meant the history and development of adding reports.
Okay. Sure.
Different subsets of the research, not history and development.
Right. Okay, fair enough. Well, I mean, Freedom in the World's been around since 1972.
Right.
I don't know exactly what the motivation was at that time to put it together. Part of it is just that, that as research has become more sophisticated on the types of things that are important in democracies, there has been a profusion of new indexes that address more specific things. So Freedom in the World is like the 1.0 of evaluating these sorts of things. It became more and more evident over the years that we needed to look more specifically at different elements of it. Freedom of the press, information has always been considered extremely important, both in and of itself as a critical part of a democratic society, and also as sort of a symbolic thing where a level of press freedom often is correlated with other sorts of democracy issues. So that was one that Freedom House also started, decades ago. More recently, Nations in Transit started, in order to take a look at specifically at the development of the post-Soviet and former Eastern Bloc countries as they moved into this transitional phase. And then Countries at the Crossroads began in 2004 as indexes were becoming more sophisticated, and we were more on the generation 2.0 of indexes in general, and a decision was made to look more at specific things. So in the case of Countries at the Crossroads, that's state action generally, democratic governance through the window of what is the state doing to improve its levels. So, bit better? All right.
Thank you. I think we have time for just a few more questions. There was one over here and then one over here. So let's start here. Let's see who wants to take up the question, which is on conflict resolution versus conflict transformation, and whether GPI maybe can better address the transformation issues. Mark?
I like the GPI. I like those concepts. I don't think the GPI speaks to it a lot because it's too static until process variables are incorporated. So that I want to take a conflict like Northern Ireland, and I want to know how it was transformed or how it was. I don't love the word resolved because they still, everything's not great, but it's a whole lot better than it was. So to me, it's a real success. But I don't think the GPI is particularly measuring those kinds of things, and that's because its task is a little different. There are some of the indicators that might give you a few insights. In fact, Northern Ireland is just a region in the UK, so it's not even in the sample, but I don't think conceptually it addresses the same variables. That's not essentially a bad thing about it, it's just a limit to it.